Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining our webinar today. In the next hour or half hour or so, I'll be talking with David Rothschild, the creator of PredictWise, about the value of prediction markets. So if you have any questions during the webinar, feel free to email them to events@predictit.org. David Rothschild is an economist at Microsoft in New York City and the creator of PredictWise. He has a PhD in applied economics from the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania. His most popular work has focused on predicting elections and an economic take on public policy. In 2012, he correctly predicted 50 out of 51 electoral college outcomes. How are you doing today, David?
Very well, thank you. Thank you for having me on.
Of course. Thank you for joining us. So I guess we'll go ahead and just get started. So the first question I wanted to ask you, a lot of times we hear about how valuable polling is, but why are prediction markets so valuable in the data that they produce?
Sure, and so many of you may have heard when I was on earlier this year, and so I'll try to give you some different insight from things that have been happening recently. And of course, one good place to start is thinking about what did we learn during the primary season this year. What we know is that polling didn't do too badly. So polling was out there for a good number of the contests, and they had some decent accuracy rates. But what we also saw at the same time was that prediction markets were out there for every contest. They were out there earlier than polling data. And while the accuracy was similar, in a similar ballpark over the ones in which both polls and prediction markets covered, prediction markets were doing slightly less accurate, but still very accurate over the other elections that were not covered by polling. And these are traditionally smaller states or caucus states, especially heavy in caucus states, in which is harder to predict. So simply as a market intelligence vehicle to understand what was going on and what was going to happen in the primary season, you can see right there that prediction markets with the ability to scale easy were providing a very unique benefit. If you want to dive into something, let's talk about Indiana, obviously a very pivotal state that just went through in the last week. The polling data was extremely sparse, so the polling in Indiana started later, and this is due to actually extremely high costs in running polling in Indiana, which clamps down very heavily on auto calls. You had Nate Silver over at 538 forecasting Cruz victory up through Sunday prior to the election. Now, part of that was due to the polls, but also to his enhanced poll plus model, where prediction markets very cleanly switched over to Trump, as probably many of you know, as the New York primary was coming through on April 19th. And so just kind of understanding what was going to happen earlier, more coverage, really unique. And so from a domain perspective, they really provide a lot of insight into this year's election.
That's really interesting. Kind of going back to what you said, you were saying about how caucus states are a little bit harder to predict than just traditional primary states. Why is that?
There is obviously the correlated fact that there's less polling, but more important is the fact that voter turnout is actually a relatively stable phenomenon. If you have access to the right data, what you're going to see is that voter turnout is something that is not incredibly hard to predict. But once you start moving into things like the caucuses, you're having extremely low voter turnout by definition. And the smaller the voter turnout, the more variability and the more noise actually affects the elections, the harder it is to predict. And so ultimately, when you ask people to come and spend 2 to 5 minutes of their time voting in a primary, or unfortunately, if it's in Arizona or other places, several hours, but that's still several hours, right? That's still actually less time in many of those long lines than it takes to vote in Iowa or in other caucuses. And so the amount of variability that you see there definitely increases, and it makes it harder for polls to get that right mix of what the target population ultimately is. And so that's one thing. And then the second thing is a lot of them are correlated with smaller states, which are also more difficult to capture.
Huh, that's very insightful. So going back to what you said about like the variability of the different demographics. So obviously this year it's been kind of, I guess, what you could characterize as a very unpredictable election. You know, Donald Trump as our nominee. I think about, you know, maybe a year ago, not many people, you know, would have seen that coming. So do you think that prediction markets are still going to have a really great accuracy this year, even in this unpredictable or election?
So let's talk about the accuracy of prediction markets and polls in the overall outcome space. Basically, we will never know the God-given underlying probability of Donald Trump winning the GOP nomination on July 1st, 2015 or January 1st, 2016. What we do know is that it wasn't zero. That's pretty much the only thing we can say definitively. Now, you had a lot of pundits and other people out there saying that approach zero was zero. Markets had Trump down at 2 or 3 percentage points right when he launched the campaign, you know, 5 percentage points, 10 percentage points into the very early fall, and then, of course, shot up heavily in January, about a month prior to the first voting. And, you know, we don't really know what that means as far as accuracy, but what we can tell you, what I can tell you is that I was kind of happy to see that it really split the difference between what the polling data, the raw polling data was showing with a continuous Trump lead, which we know historically we shouldn't take as saying that he is going to win. We had 11 different lead changes in the 2012 primary. It's very standard for people to pop up and pop down, but then the pundits who were literally giving kind of 0% probabilities at these early stages. So, you know, it's hard to look. It's easy to look at the state by state and say, look, prediction markets did really well in the state by state outcomes. And now, of course, we're talking about 7 to 10 days in, maybe 30 days in at the max of when they were starting to predict any individual state beyond the first few. But that accuracy was pretty strong. And when we turn into the general election, what we're looking at is, you know, I'm sure at some point soon we'll have the state-by-state up on predicted. They'll have all the Senate races and all the gubernatorial races, and most of them already up. And, you know, we talk about the uniqueness of this election, but in many ways people will fall into certain older habits, and I don't think this is going to be shockingly unique when it comes to looking at the electoral map. We have decreased variability in the electoral map as we've moved past 1992, and that's been quite a few years now. And there's nothing in voter turnout data or anything that we're seeing even in these early polls to indicate that we're going to see a seismic shift.
Oh, wow. So you were mentioning earlier about how, you know, when Trump first launched his campaign, he seemed to be a little bit down in the markets, and then, you know, in the month prior to, you know, the first primary, he seemed to really shoot up. And so with that, you know, I'm sure that a lot of campaigns at the time, you know, they really thought that, for example, maybe Jeb Bush or Marco Rubio were, you know, really leading the pack at that point, even though the prediction markets, you know, might have said otherwise. So do you think that campaigns, you know, at the national level should, you know, be paying more attention to what the prediction markets are saying and kind of incorporating that with the polls that they're already using?
It's tough because, in a way, we have several different actors. We have stakeholders who are investors, and they're thinking about where should I put my money? Where am I going to have the best marginal impact? And you have people who are casually following along and care about it as citizens of this country, or political scientists who want to know what impact different things are happening. And then you have campaigns that are essentially allocating the resources on the ground. And so prediction markets definitely, as they are constructed generally, provide really great insight into probability of victory, but not generally built around vote share and detailed demographic breakdown of vote share. And so if I were looking at this as an investor, someone who's looking to be part of the billions of dollars that will be spread around to different campaigns, prediction markets provide a great overview of where things are tight and where things are going to be very strong, and that should help you a lot in thinking about where you allocate your investments. If you are somebody who is caring about your democracy and wants to know what's going on, clearly you probably care about this probability of victory, as well as if you're a political scientist who's looking at the kind of impact of major events. But if you're on a campaign, what you ultimately care about is a lot more detailed than what most markets are covering, which is questions about detailed demographic subgroups in detailed geographic constraints. So that being the case, I think it gives some sort of overview, especially we're thinking about nationally allocating resources. But until we start looking at markets with a little more structure into turnout and sentiment on a very localized level, it's probably not as helpful when it comes to allocation of resources.
Okay, great. Well, in talking about, we're talking about campaigns, paying attention to prediction markets. What about, the average American or, the average person that's on, Predictit or PredictWise? What should they be paying attention to as far as what the markets are saying for the 2016 election?
So, I think that right now you're looking at something which is quite interesting on the overall general election, the presidential election, which is to say, if you look at fundamental data, if you look at historical presidential turnout, historical questions about incumbency and economic indicators, you're seeing something that should give the Democrats about 50 to 55% likelihood of winning. If you look at just the polling data and you assume that the hypothetical polling data is acting as it would historically, and I think that's a big if, because generally this head-to-head polling data starts having identification sometime in mid-April. But also we generally know who the two candidates are in mid-April, so these are not as hypothetical questions, which can have a lot more noise when the population doesn't really know yet who these candidates are. The population is thinking a lot about Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, or Ted Cruz and Donald Trump, as they took these hypothetical head-to-head polls over the last few weeks, whereas in 2012 when they heard Mitt Romney and Barack Obama, that really was what they're already thinking about. And so I think that these polls, which are showing a fairly commanding lead by Hillary Clinton, it would translate historically into something like a 90 or 95% probability of victory for Clinton, are overshooting. And so it's good to see the prediction markets kind of splitting that difference, and it seems reasonable, though again we won't know the full extent of that. But I'll give you kind of two sets of answers for us. If you are following this as a general reader, just kind of learning, I think that you're going to get an idea that this is a race that's going to start out with a heavy advantage for the Democratic candidate. To be clear, in-trade, Betfair were both around 60% for Obama this time in 2012 and 2008. So that's going to give you a base point. If you're an investor in markets, you're following them, you're probably pretty interested right now in the difference between bookies and Betfair and a lot of other foreign exchanges and Predictit, which has been a little more bullish on the Republican candidates than the overseas markets, and trying to follow and figure how those distinctions will move and whether or not that will provide a similar path that the in-trade Betfair break did in 2012.
That's really interesting. Just switching focus just a little bit. So I wanted to talk with you a little bit about the wisdom of the crowd sentiment that a lot of people talk about in prediction markets. So we know that prediction markets are more accurate because you have so many different people kind of putting in their input into the market about what's going to happen. So what about those crowds makes them more accurate than, say, a single person?
So it's a really good question, which is to think, and kind of flip this on head, is to think that if you just had one person, what question would you want to ask them about the election? And obviously, if you ask them who they're going to vote for, you would see that generally in the last, X number of elections, even in landslides, the losing candidate gets like 40%. So you have a pretty good chance of it not being accurate. If you ask someone, what's the subjective probability that a given candidate is going to win, you're getting a lot more information from that person, and you're learning a lot about what people think is going to happen. Now, if you have 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 people and they're not randomly sampled out of the general population, then you continue to look and say, well, let me ask this question, which is extremely dense and extremely meaningful and average across them. And if you get more and more people with different points of view, this question provides a really, really strong outcome for you. Now, of course, if you could poll the entire population or an actual perfectly representative population, you may be focusing on this question about who people would vote for, because obviously that's ultimately what's going down. But since that's not possible, this question the prediction markets ask is extremely powerful. And as you think about doing it across a lot of different people, wisdom of the crowds works when you have a diversification of information. So if I ask one person or 1,000 people, but they all have the exact same information and they have the exact same interpretation of that information, then that's not going to do me any good. I mean, that extra 999 people are going to give you the same answer as the first person. Markets tend to incentivize people with diverse points of view and diverse information. They're looking at idiosyncratic and dispersed information, and they are finding different ways to model it. And so you bring that all together and it becomes a very powerful tool, having incentivizing this diverse points of view to come in and answer this very powerful question.
That's really interesting. I was just thinking when you were talking about how in prediction markets, people are incentivized with, all these different types of information and how, they process it differently. So can you explain how, someone who is in a prediction market like PredictIt, how are they different from someone who is just called up, from a polling system?
Right. So essentially, one of the things which I've always been obsessed with from an academic point of view is this idea that in many ways a market is like a continuously running poll. The difference, of course, is that in a poll, we attempt to reach a random representative person. In a prediction market, we encourage people who are precisely not random, people who have increased information about the election, people who are following it very closely. And we also then take that information and we aggregate it in a very unique way. We weigh people more heavily the more amount of money they're willing to lay on the line. And so they're different in many, many ways. Observably, we know that the users of prediction market don't look like a cross-section of the United States from their geographies, their race, and their education levels, gender and age. And we also know that beyond that, they have higher levels of information about what they're talking about. And so it's a very unique way of thinking about how to predict an outcome, which is to say the $20 billion survey research industry is built all around getting random and representative. But markets say, let's just encourage those people with the right information and actually get them into the room together. And historically, that's proven quite effective.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's very insightful. Yeah, when you were talking about, how, polling is more random while prediction markets, it's not so random, you're also saying how, the people in a prediction market, they're not like a cross-section of the U.S. They have different age, gender, and things like that, and they also have higher levels of information. Is there any other defining qualities that you think that prediction market users have that kind of bind them all together and give them the ability to predict future events accurately?
It's a good question, and so it gets to the heart of beyond the observable characteristics, what do we know about people who are in prediction markets versus the general population, and how's that work? And there are some kind of key things. Some of it's good and some of it's bad. So we know that, for instance, one underlying reason that people are there is that they have a slight risk-loving tendency versus the general population. They're investors, right? Investors, by definition, are people who are interested in placing wagers, in putting money on the line in things in which could return or may not return. We know that people who are in markets also have, beyond certain levels of information about events, they also have certain underlying skills in order to analyze that information. And so it's not just about knowing about politics, it's also understanding how to translate the information you have into something which, as I said, is inherently quite complex, thinking about the subjective probability of an outcome space. And whereas the first one, in theory, is maybe not helpful, maybe that causes problems in a sense, is that we prefer, we as an academics and economists prefer people to be risk neutral. We want somebody to always provide us with true probabilities and not, say, get enjoyment out of engaging in risky ventures. That leads to a bit distortion in how people play the game. But on the other hand, people's higher level of statistical literacy and their ability to incorporate information in a coherent and a complex way, that's extremely useful because we also made this assumption that people can do that, and markets are inherently complex. And so there's a lot of things that set people apart from the general population, and some of them make things more efficient, and some of them possibly work against us.
That's really great. And so I believe it's about 2:50 now. I think we're going to take some questions from the audience. And so just a reminder to anybody listening, if you have a question for David, please email it to events@predictit.org. So our first question is from one of our users, and he says, I believe that the overseas markets, he thinks that they lag behind the U.S. markets, and so that the London bookies, for example, will move odds slower than the market. So he wants to know if you agree with that sentiment.
Yeah, so we saw that extremely clearly in 2008 and 2012 with Betfair and Intrade. And I haven't done as extensive look at it yet, but I would be, just from the stuff that we've looked at, I'd be surprised if we don't see that. So for instance, in 2012, we saw that the best predictor of Betfair's price 12 hours from now was not Betfair's price right now, but it was Intrade's price right now. And so there was a definite lag, and I expect we to see that. One of the things, though, going on with that, though, is that we are also seeing increased volatility in the predicted markets relative to the Betfair markets, and that could be a good thing, or it could be adding additional noise as more traders are interacting in a given time period. So that's something that we hope to dissect as best as we can.
Great. We have another question. So this person also tuned into the last webinar that we had with Emil Servan-Schreiber, and in that webinar he kind of told us that he studies prediction markets from the perspective of cognitive psychology, which we all thought was very interesting, but however you study prediction markets from an economics perspective. So can you talk about what research questions you're answering about prediction markets in the perspective of economics?
Definitely. So one of the things which is extremely exciting about prediction markets is to get a relatively transparent look at how markets function under different designs and different types of users. And so in financial markets, there's very little understanding of what goes on in some of the larger markets, especially as far as how traders are interacting. Here we have a very clear order book. We can see very clearly as prices move. We also have a very strong understanding of some of the information that is flowing in. And so as an economist, what we're looking at here is studying the effect of different market designs on how people interact with each other in the marketplace. Further, of course, what I hope to learn more of is also understanding how people make these decisions, and part of that will come from understanding better what people's expectations are while they're engaging in the markets, understanding that with outside polling data has been very useful, although we don't have on an individual level data with traders here. And thinking a lot about this interaction between what people are trying to gain from being in a market. What does their utility function look like? Is it about maximizing the returns, or do they have a certain enjoyment of being in the market, or do they have a certain enjoyment of buying stocks on their candidates they support, or are they trying to think efficiently, and how that interacts with people's expectations. And these are all things from an economist point of view are kind of uniquely apt for studying in a prediction market, but also have really awesome implications for financial markets the more we learn.
Oh, wow, that's really interesting. And so for our last question, so this person says, I'm wondering if there has been an observable difference in accuracy between not-for-money platforms and platforms that do use a real money exchange like Predicted.
Yeah, so there's quite a few exchanges out there, Ballotcraft and others that you may have seen, Pivot to an extent, that have various levels of non-monetary payment. They also have a mixture of pure markets and certain statistical models underlying them. And I haven't gone through and tested everything, but one of the things we see very clearly, which I saw very clearly, is number one is, of course, markets with real money incentivize things to move faster in real time. And that's the huge advantage, because that's one of the key advantages, that you guys are all highly incentivized, highly motivated to show up and make differences when information flows. Number two, that we're seeing much better calibration. The calibration of the real money prediction markets, Predicted especially, has been excellent. And when I say calibration, I mean that if you look at the predictions for the 80 or so primaries that have gone through on Predicted, and you plot essentially the predictions on the x-axis, rounded to the nearest value of 10 per se, and then you plot on the y-axis what percentage of them came true, they're extremely, extremely accurate in that. When the prediction markets say 80%, you know, about 8 and 10 are occurring. When they say 90%, about 9 and 10 of those are occurring. And what you're seeing just from the small snippet of data that I pulled down for some of these other markets is that they're not as well calibrated. They're not pushing further towards 80, 90, or 100 as well as Predicted has done so far this election cycle. So I think that the speed of updating and the overall calibration has been very, very strong in the real money markets. We don't expect it, nor have I seen it in what I've just looked at quickly in the non-real money markets.
Great. Well, I would say that's all the time that we have for questions. So, you know, as we come to the close of the webinar, I want to give you a big thank you, David, for joining us and sharing your insights with us this afternoon. I'm sure that all of you found that what David had to say was very insightful and interesting. And thanks to all of you who joined the webinar as well. I hope that you're having a great time on Predicted, and I hope that you're doing well. If you have any suggestions on who you'd like to see as a future guest on one of our webinars, you know, send your feedback over to events@predicted.org, and we'll try to see what we can do. So thank you so much, David, and thank you so much to everybody on the webinar. Have a great day.
Thank you. Have a good day.